Hey everybody, welcome back. Ready to dive in?
Ways.
Today we're getting into something that's, well, kind of relevant to everything, right? How we interpret the Bible.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It's huge GE. Like, how can one book spark so many debates? But that's what we're going to unpack, how people reach such different conclusions from, like, the same exact text.
It's kind of wild when you think about it, right?
Uh,
You see folks using the Bible to back up completely opposite views on things like social justice or gender roles.
it's like they're reading two totally different books, you know?
Totally.
So to really get this, we're going straight to the source. A historical debate on slavery. Our source material lays out how both sides use the Bible to, get this, actually argue their case.
It's fascinating, yeah, and kind of unsettling when you think about it.
It's really heavy stuff.
Yeah,
So the pro-slavery folks, they often pointed to what the Bible didn't say. Like, they'd argue, hey, it never actually condemns slavery directly, so it must be okay.
it's like that whole silence equals consent argument.
Exactly. But it gets, like, wilder, right? They'd go a step further and use the Old Testament regulations on slavery as proof that it was good, ordained by God even.
Yeah, they'd be all, look, it's regulated, not banned. Exodus even talks about how much to pay for a slave. They thought that settled it.
Like it was all above board and officially sanctioned. Wow. And then there's the whole thing about Jesus and the apostles, right? They were living under Roman slavery, a huge part of their world, but they didn't exactly, lead a revolution against it.
Right, and that silence spoke volumes to some people.
And to make their case even stronger, they'd bring up Paul, sending that runaway slave back to his master.
Yeah, talk about a difficult passage to reconcile today. It shows how differently people saw slavery back then.
Completely different world. But the anti-slavery side, they weren't just going to sit there. They had their own interpretations, often using those same scriptures to make the opposite case.
Makes you think, huh, same text, totally different conclusions.
Totally. So they were quick to point out that slavery back then, during biblical times, was a totally different animal from the brutal chattel slavery of, America. They'd bring up the Israelites being freed from Egypt, the whole let my people go story, as proof that God hated oppression.
Yeah, that's a powerful image.
Right. And they'd emphasize how Old Testament servitude was often voluntary, even temporary, kind of like being an indentured servant, not being owned outright. Like in Deuteronomy, it talks about how Hebrew slaves were supposed to be set free after 7 years.
It's all about context, right? How things worked back then.
Totally. They were saying, sure, the Bible mentions servitude, but it's not the chattel slavery you're trying to justify. Plus, they'd argue, Jesus' entire message, love, compassion, the golden rule, that doesn't exactly line up with exploiting people.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
It's about looking at the bigger picture, the overall message.
Exactly. So this back and forth, it's not about saying who's right or wrong about the Bible and slavery. It's about realizing that just the act of interpreting, the lens we use when we read these texts, it leads to vastly different ways of seeing the world.
It shapes everything.
It really does. Okay, so we've got this prism, the Bible, and a spectrum of interpretations shining through. But hold on, this is just one example. We've got more hot button topics to explore. Sabbath, war, the role of women. Things are about to get even more interesting.
Okay, so we've seen how people interpret the Bible so differently when it comes to slavery.
Really makes you think.
Right. But that's just one example. It's not like this is the only topic where people disagree.
Oh, absolutely not.
This whole thing pops up with other, like, really important topics, too.
Huge ones. Our source material actually dives into a few more.
Yeah, it gets even more interesting.
Get ready for some more. Wait, they both use the same book for that moments.
For sure. For
So
sure.
we're talking about the Sabbath, war, and the role of women, right?
Big ones, yeah.
Areas where you'll find folks going head to head, armed with their own sets of verses,
Each side totally convinced they're right.
It's like a biblical tug of war,
Yeah.
So, okay, the Sabbath.
Okay.
You've got people saying it's like this totally unbreakable commandment, right, for Christians,
Right.
while others are all, no, it's more like a suggestion for rest and reflection.
Yeah, just take a load off,
Exactly. So what gives? How can they both be right?
Well, it comes down to how you interpret work, right?
Like what counts as work?
Exactly. Some people, they're super strict. Any work at all. Forbidden on the Sabbath. Cooking? No way. Cleaning? Absolutely not.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they're serious about it. But others, they're more relaxed, like it's more about rest from hard labor, stuff that distracts you from, like, connecting with God.
So, like, no backbreaking work, but maybe a little leisurely gardening is okay?
Maybe. Depends who you ask, right?
Wow, so your big grocery shopping trip might be off limits for some, but others are fine pushing that cart down the aisles on Saturday.
It really shows you how much our interpretation, like colors, how we see things,
It's amazing how one word can mean such different things to different people.
and it gets even more complex when you look at war.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
Talk about a head scratcher, because the Old Testament, you've got God literally sending Israel to war.
Right.
But then in the New Testament, you've got Jesus preaching peace and love.
Yeah. It's like, what are we supposed to do with that?
It can make your head spin, for sure,
Right.
but depending on which verses you focus on, you can build a case for either side, you know?
I guess so, yeah.
So the pacifists, they always point to Jesus's teachings on loving your enemies and, turning the other cheek.
Right, that's pretty clear.
But then others, they say, hold on, look at the Old Testament. God used military power sometimes to get things done.
So they use that to justify war today.
Yeah, they see it as a necessary evil
Yeah.
sometimes.
Wow, it's like this constant back and forth.
It is. And then you've got the role of women, which, man, that's a whole other can of worms.
That seems to be a never-ending debate.
Well, for sure, it's a
Like,
constant conversation.
is male headship, like, divinely ordained? Or does the Bible actually promote, like, equality?
This is where interpreting Genesis,
Yeah.
especially those first 2 chapters, gets really interesting.
Genesis, like with Adam and Eve.
The one and only. Remember how the pro-slavery folks used it to back up their views? Well, guess what?
What?
Same deal here. People using the same verses to argue for both male headship and equality between men and women.
Seriously, I don't see how that's possible. How can they both get that from the same text?
So the folks who are all about male leadership, they often point to the order of creation, right? Adam first, then Eve.
Makes sense.
To them, that's God establishing a hierarchy.
Like men are supposed to be in charge.
Exactly. And they'll point to verses where wives are told to submit to their husbands.
Okay, yeah, I can see that, I guess.
But then you've got the folks who are all about equality.
Yeah.
They focus on that line, created in God's image, right?
Right.
To them, that means men and women have equal value in God's eyes.
So no hierarchy there.
Exactly.
Mm.
And they'll bring up examples of powerful women in the Bible, like Deborah.
Gotcha.
She was a judge, like a leader and a prophetess, led Israel to victory in battle.
No way, I've never even heard of her.
She was a total badass.
Wow. So it's like everyone's playing connect the dots, but with Bible verses, they're all trying to create their own version of the big picture.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, if something is like fundamental as the role of women can be interpreted in such different ways, does that mean we can ever really understand these ancient texts? Like, how do we apply them to our modern lives?
That's something I've definitely been struggling with.
It's a big question.
It really is. Speaking of big questions, it's time to zoom out a little
Yeah.
and look at how we even approach interpreting this complicated and sometimes confusing text.
The mechanics of it all.
Right. How do we make sense of it? We'll be back to explore that right after this. And we're back. Okay, so it's been pretty eye-opening to see how, differently people can interpret the Bible, even when we're looking at the same verses.
This is really something.
But now I kind of want to get into how we even, start to interpret these old texts in the first place.
Now we're getting to the good stuff.
Right, so we have to talk about hermeneutics.
That's kind of intimidating. But really, it's just a fancy way of saying, how do we figure out what a text means?
What's the message behind the words?
Exactly. We're trying to crack the code. And with the Bible, you've got some people, they take it literally, word for word.
Like a divine instruction manual?
Exactly. But then others, they're more focused on the historical and cultural context.
Like the who, what, when, where of a passage.
Exactly. Like who wrote it, when, why,
Yeah.
and how did people understand it back then?
It's amazing how much our starting point can change how we see things.
Totally. And it gets even trickier when you realize some folks, they put the New Testament on a pedestal. Like it's the ultimate guide for Christian living.
Makes sense, right, since it's about Jesus.
Right. But then you got others saying, hold on, the Old Testament is important too. It lays the groundwork.
So, you need both to get the full picture.
Exactly. It's all connected. And on top of that, you've got people focusing on tiny little verses while others are trying to grasp those bigger, broader themes.
So, what happens when those specific instructions, those verses that seem to condone slavery, clash with those broader principles, like love your neighbor?
$1 million question right there. And that, my friend, is where hermeneutics comes in.
Okay, I'm listening.
We have to ask those tough questions, like, is the Bible purely God's word, dictated perfectly? Or is it also a human document shaped by the people who wrote it in their own time and place?
Man, it's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. It's not just a book. It's this living, breathing conversation that people have been having for centuries.
Exactly. Shaped by everything. History, culture, power struggles. It's all there.
So wow, if the Bible can be interpreted in such wildly different ways, what does that even say about truth itself? Is truth absolute and unchanging? Or is it something like we're always shaping and reshaping?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one we could spend a lifetime unpacking.
Hmm?
But here's the thing. It's not about deciding who's right or wrong.
Hmm.
It's about trying to understand where other people are coming from.
I like that. It's about understanding, not judging.
Exactly. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. If even a book as important as the Bible can be interpreted in such different ways, what other assumptions might we be holding on to that deserve a closer look? What other truths could benefit from a little hermeneutical exploration? Keep asking those questions, my friends, and keep diving deep.
And that's our show for today, folks. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.